Welcome to the Long Covid podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long Covid podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Deen and Patrick Ussher, and we're going to talk about a whole load of stuff around excessive thirst and how this relates to Long Covid and POTS and ME/CFS and what brought these guys together as well. So a very warm welcome, both of you, to the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie.
So to kick off, maybe you would just introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Patrick Ussher. I'm an ME/CFS patient. I've been ill for 6 years. Initially, I was pretty not functional, down at 2,500 steps for a few years. I'm more functional these days, thankfully. And one of the symptoms I suffered from was excessive thirst, and to the point actually that I was hospitalized with life-threatening low blood sodium levels. So that's what I'll be talking with people about today.
I'm officially still a professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen, but I'm not practically active anymore. I've always been very interested to understand how our body works in order to improve the quality of life of patients and people in general. And let's say for the last year, I focused on ME/CFS because I see the high need with the patients of having more clarity about the things. And in fact, I also started a company which is called Strategy for Health, in which I develop a diagnosis and a sensor for helping Long Covid and ME/CFS patients out based on the underlying mechanism that I think I understand. Now, maybe you would like to tell Patrick how we met?
We met after I wrote a blog about the thirst, and then we connected then to refine it further. But we can come to that point of the story later. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here because, obviously my knowledge of Long Covid doesn't actually go back quite far enough to your experience because you became unwell before Long Covid was a thing. But, I don't know how long it really took. It took longer than it should have. But, before people started making a connection between Long Covid and ME/CFS, which has obviously been around for many, many, many more years than Long Covid has. But I think the jury is still out on whether they are the same illness. But what we do know, obviously, is that there are a lot of crossovers. But I think what is also just really cool is that people are starting to take things into their own hands. They are thinking, okay, well, this is showing up for me. So what can I do? And this is where we're getting some really cool kind of research collaborations, which is, I guess, what has brought you guys together kind of across the world as well, to try to look into all these different bits and pieces of the illness, because what we also know is that one person with Long Covid is one person with Long Covid. One person with ME/CFS is one person. So there's a lot of different presentations. So maybe to start with, excessive thirst. I mean, this is something that does come up again a lot in Long Covid. We talk a lot about electrolytes and hydration and stuff, and I imagine it's similar in a lot of the ME/CFS world. But, your experience had sort of worse consequences. What does excessive thirst actually feel like? We've all known that feeling of, we haven't drunk enough today, but what does it feel like to you?
Well, Jackie, you're absolutely right. My experience was at the more extreme end. And it seems to operate on a spectrum amongst ME/CFS and Long Covid patients. I know from one study of long COVID patients, about 10,000 people were asked, what are your worst symptoms? And 40% of them said that excessive thirst was one of their worst things that they had to deal with. But I knew that when I was experiencing it, I was at the worst end. I was aware of a few other people online who were as bad as I had also been hospitalized. But I was it became something very serious, as you said. So excessive thirst, in a way, it can sound quite benign, because it's sort of like, it's just thirst, right? It doesn't sound like such a big deal. But when I was at my very worst with this, which was in mid-2020 until January 2021, I had a 6-month period. I call it my descent into hell. And what was interesting about it was the thirst was always really bad whenever I crashed. So whenever I was in post-exertional malaise, it went just through the roof. And it was basically like every single muscle in my body, every single part of my body was screaming with thirst. It was just the most dramatic signal that was like ramped up far and beyond anything I'd ever previously experienced before. And no matter how much water I drank, I could never quench the thirst. And it just ended up into this cycle. I would feel this terrible thirst. I would drink a lot of water. And half an hour later, I've already peed all of that out. And then the cycle would just begin again. And I was clueless. I was really clueless as to why I could never quench it. So whole body screaming with thirst. The other thing is, although I didn't understand at the time, I had this very horrible sensation that blood was not reaching my skin or my brain. So it felt like inside of me, I was actually drying up. Now I know that's low blood volume, but at the time I didn't know. So there were things like that. And actually during that period, I mean, my good days I was drinking were 6 to 8 liters. That was when I wasn't in a crash. When I was in a crash, I could drink, no joke, between 10 and 20 liters over 24 hours. And it was particularly bad at night. Like if I was in a bad crash at night, I could drink 10 liters overnight and I would feel like my muscles were twitching and kind of spasming. So these were very extreme symptoms. I remember one time waking my dad up and going into him and saying, look, can you please hold me? So these were very severe symptoms that I struggled with. And I was always walking on this tightrope. If I crashed, I went into hell for 2 or 3 days and then it would become more manageable. If I just lay very still, the thirst would go down. But yeah, that's what it's like, Jackie, when you're at that extreme end, whole body is screaming with it. And no matter how much water you drink, it never works.
Yeah, and this is something that's, again, as a person who just needs to know everything, which is me, people started talking about, oh, you need to increase your fluid intake. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's something I can do. Let's drink some water. But as you say, drinking water on its own isn't necessarily going to help because it goes straight through you. And actually, it makes things worse in some ways because then you just need to get up to pee all the time. And that's disruptive to rest, it's disruptive to sleep, and it's not putting the water into the places it needs to go. So I suppose that's where the salt comes in. But, adding salt to everything willy-nilly is also a little bit unsafe, certainly for some people. So maybe we need to hand this over to Peter. And I mean, this is a really wide open question, isn't it? What's the sort of scientific explanation for what's going on here? We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
Because for me, when the blog from Patrick was there, it was for me quite surprising that water was involved here, because I've worked for 15 to 20 years scientifically on water homeostasis. And let's say the reason for that effect also Patrick figured out, and that's why I think this guy is an amazing person, Patrick, because he figured out so many different scientific things that I would have loved if my PhD students would have done the same thing, or postdocs. He's not even a biology student, he did it himself. But they say the explanation is when you normally have a low blood volume, your body tells you that you need to take more salts because you feel a bit weak, and you say, hey, I take a chip or whatever, something salty, and you would like to take some salt. And when you then take salt and your blood becomes a bit more salty, you could say, then it gives your body a very strong signal to drink more water. And what's so surprising in this case with long COVID and ME/CFS patients is that, let's say that there is a sense for water, but there's hardly any sense to take some salt. And that's because we discussed it, Patrick and I said, well, the first sense that he had is to drink more water without having any crave for salt. And that's just quite a paradox physiologically, because normally, as said, you're going to get a sense for salt, and then when your salts increase in your blood, then you're going to be thirsty. But now you have only the thirst, and in some way you can explain it, because let's say there are papers out which show that ME/CFS patients, but let's say that apparently the enzymes which tell your body that you have to take more salt are not increasing in somebody who's in a low blood volume. So that's physiologically quite a paradox. When you don't have the increase of these hormones, you don't get a taste for salt. So that means that explains why you want to drink water instead of that you would like to have some salt as well. And that you more or less have to tell yourself that it's better to, because of the low volume, to take salt as well. And Patrick does it in the form of ORS, which is then glucose and salt and water. And that's the most efficient way in which your intestine can take up salt, because those are particular proteins which are taking glucose and sodium from the one side to the other, and then water will follow. So that's a bit of a nutshell what is happening.
Just to add to what Peter is saying, we know that in ME/CFS, from a paper by two Dutch researchers, Ussher and Van Kampen, that ME/CFS patients can be 1 litre or more short on blood. So they may only have 4 litres rather than 5. And actually in their paper, which was called Low Blood Volume in Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Relation to Complaints, they found that one of the patients had 1.5 litres less blood than normal. And this is something that creates a lot of the symptoms of ME/CFS, including the exercise intolerance, because your heart can't exercise if you don't have enough blood in you. But it also will create this signal for thirst, as Peter is alluding to, because the brain actually has, I never knew this before all of this ordeal, but the brain actually has 2 thirst centers, one for water and one for blood, called the hypovolemic thirst center. And so that was what I later worked out was actually going on in me. I was never thirsty for water. I was like Dracula, I was actually thirsty for blood, as it were. It's a new take on ME/CFS, that. But also, just to pick up again on what Peter is saying, that these hormones that control salt retention, they're called renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone. They work together as a group. They're called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis, or RAS. And in a healthy person, they're working great to keep your salt levels up. But in ME/CFS, it doesn't work. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is suppressed. We know that from a few different papers. And because of that, you're losing salt all the time. Every time you go to the toilet, you're peeing out salt, and your blood volume is going down, down, down. And over time, it eventually settles somewhere quite low. And then you're getting the hypovolemic thirst, the thirst for the low blood volume. As Peter says, it's a paradox because, you would expect someone to crave something salty when they're in that situation, but they don't, because angiotensin 2, one of those hormones, is responsible for salt craving. And so if it's getting diminished, you don't even experience a craving for salty water. So you're just drinking water and making the situation worse.
So the signals are all scrambled. You're not getting the signals that you should be. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, again, it's an interesting take on it. People with long COVID and ME/CFS are vampires. There's probably a paper in there somewhere. But joking aside, this is something that comes up. Again, you have more knowledge in the ME/CFS world, but certainly in the long COVID world, low blood volume linked to dysautonomia in POTS. Again, very, very, very common. And also, a lot of people have had some success with increasing the hydration with the salts or electrolytes, doing one or other doesn't seem to do it, as you have discovered. But both together can really make a difference. It's not a cure, but it can make a lot of difference. And I mean, like you were saying about the signals, if you don't understand, then you can't do anything about it. Whereas if we now kind of understand, okay, well, probably low blood volume, probably hydration issues of some description. My body isn't giving me those signals, but I know that it should be. So therefore, I can maybe look into things like hydration and salts, and I know that I need to add the salts in. And therefore, I can actually do it, even though my body's not telling me that I need to. So I suppose that's where starting to understand a bit of what's going on can actually be hugely helpful, because otherwise, how would you know to do that? So, it's knowledge is power, isn't it? We may not be able to solve the whole problem in a oneer, but each little piece of knowledge makes us have a little bit more understanding. And that little bit more understanding then gives us some ideas of what we can do. As you just alluded to, low blood volume, what you said, 4 liters out of 5, that's 20%. That's actually huge.
Yeah,
And then when you're talking about things like oxygenation of your cells, which is hugely important, if you have a low blood volume, it's not carrying the right amount of oxygen around either. So that may link into some of the other things that we're starting to see about oxygenation and the oxygen getting to the right places and all of that sort of stuff, which is starting to sidestep into the breathing world. And I promised we weren't going to go too far down that rabbit hole. But it is super, super interesting, isn't it? That there is now more knowledge starting to come out about this. And I suppose, does this maybe tangent quite nicely into your collaboration? Now, you guys met, I think, Patrick, you said that you'd written an article and you've also written a book, I think, which I can link into the show notes if people want to follow that up. And that brought you two together. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Jackie. If I may, just in order to explain how the collaboration came about, I'll just have to back up a little bit. What happened is I ended up in hospital. That was in January 2021. And I was hospitalized with a low blood sodium level of 116. So the normal range is about 135, I think, to 145 or something like that. So it was a very low blood sodium level. And, it was a very dangerous situation because your brain can swell and you can get into a coma or whatever. So I was hospitalized. I was treated. I learned from my medical records later that I was essentially being treated as an intensive care patient, but in a standard bed. They didn't have space in the ICU at that time. So I was getting bloods every 2 hours, morning and night, etc. It was quite a serious situation. At the end of that week, they diagnosed me with something called primary polydipsia, also known as psychogenic polydipsia. And this is a condition that it is basically thought that people are drinking a lot of water, not because they need to, but because they're mentally ill. And they have some kind of strange psychological compulsion to spend their whole day drinking water when they don't actually need to. So that was what I was diagnosed with. And I was treated throughout my time in hospital, not by everyone, but by a few people, as if I was mentally ill. I would be talked to in a way that suggested that I wasn't being treated as in a way that I felt was kind of dignified at times. And I did at one point also hear them having a laugh about their psychogenic polydipsia patient. They didn't know that I could hear them. So this was quite humiliating. I tried to explain that ME patients can be very thirsty. I pointed to some papers about it, but they didn't want to hear. So I got out of hospital. My blood sodium was normalized, and I was very grateful for that. And over the following couple of weeks, I had to then try and work out myself what was probably happening. And that's when I stumbled upon the ideas of low blood volume, and I was able to fix that. And we can talk more about oral rehydration solution and so on later. But it had a magical effect on my thirst when I was able to work out that I was actually thirsty for a lack of blood. But I just wanted to put the whole situation behind me because it had been quite traumatizing, and I just wanted to move on with my life as best as I could. But about a year and a half later, I had this little voice nagging away in the back of my head saying, what is psychogenic polydipsia all about? Who came up with it? What is its history? What's its rationale? So I started to research the papers that have been written about psychogenic polydipsia. There's not many. There's only about 300, 350 lifetime papers, which is nothing. I went back to the beginning, 1930s, 1940s, and I read through pretty much every paper, at least the abstract, but I actually read through most of them in detail. And I was really struck by a few different things. The first is the people even writing today about psychogenic polydipsia say that they don't know what causes it. They say that they actually regard it as a mystery. And some people will say, but even though they say that, they nevertheless make the following leap to it must be psychological. So it's a similar pattern. We don't know what it is, therefore it must be mental health. Then I saw the fact that nothing much had actually changed, except for a few little things, since papers back in the late 1950s. That essentially those people back in the 40s and 50s had worked out what they thought it was, a psychological problem, and they had their rationale. But that since 1959, the amount of change in understanding is negligible. It's kind of remained a bit like a medical relic. Then I was thinking, okay, that's interesting. Then I found out that the fact that the brain has a thirst center for blood was only discovered in 1968. So the people who were trying to understand this thirst at the beginning didn't even know that you could be thirsty for a lack of blood. Never mind the fact that they didn't know anything about ME/CFS either. Then, when I was reading a paper from 1959 called Compulsive Water Drinking, which is another term for psychogenic water drinking, and it's by two people, Barlow and de Wardener, and they were looking at case studies of so-called compulsive water drinkers. I was reading these case studies, and they were full of terrible blame the victim Freudian stuff from the part of the authors. But I was reading them and I was saying, these are ME/CFS patients, because when I was reading about their symptoms from all the way back, these people in 1959, it was actually things like they developed health problems after other, health conditions. They were breathless upon exertion. They ached everywhere. They had loss of stamina. One of the patients in that paper was described, I kid you not, as having hysterical weakness of the legs. So if that's not a Freudian term for post-exertional malaise, I don't know what is. So I was thinking then, in ME/CFS, people are thirsty with a very similar pattern. Dilute urine, hyponatremia, unquenchable thirst. The pattern in psychogenic water drinking that is taught to medical students is the same, hyponatremia and dilute urine, and they're always drinking. And I thought to myself, has it always been a mistake? Has what they call psychogenic water drinking, at least in a subset of patients, always been a misreading of thirsty ME/CFS patients, POTS patients, who actually have the same symptom presentation because they don't have enough blood, and that's why they're thirsty. So this hypothesis formed in my mind, and I said, Patrick, you're probably going to have to write something about this. So I sat down to write something. I thought it'll be 10,000 words, we'll leave it there. But the more I researched, the more it grew. And in the end, I spent a year working on a book. It ended up being 50,000 words. And it's called The Myth of Primary Polydipsia, Why Hypovolemic Dehydration Can Explain the Real Physiological Basis of So-Called Psychogenic Water Drinking. And in that, I went through the whole history of primary polydipsia, its Freudianism. People used to say back then that these patients were having these symptoms because they weren't having enough sex or because they were female. Like that was the level, right? I went through all of that. I went through the stuff in ME/CFS, and I put forward a new theory. Now, of course, you published a book, but no one's necessarily going to read it. So then I wanted to write some blogs about it. So I wrote a blog for Health Rising, which is the wonderful ME/CFS Long Covid POTS blog run by Court Johnson, in which I summarized my experience and the arguments in the book. And then that blog was published back in December. And I really hoped that it was going to lead to something. I was really longing for some kind of collaboration, someone who had experience to come out of the ether and say, this is interesting, let's work together. And my prayers were answered. And Peter wrote me an email and said, I really enjoyed reading your blog, let's have a Zoom chat. And so that, because Peter has a background in water metabolism, he already knew about psychogenic water drinking in great detail. And, he's someone who's interested in solving puzzles. So that's how we then came to actually collaborate.
I said that is indeed was the connection, and then I was amazed that Patrick, not being a biology student at all, was able to figure this out as a patient. So it was really cool, and I directly felt the connection because this was water. In fact, I've worked for about 20 years on water homeostasis. In fact, a bit of a different disease, which is called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So those are people who lose a lot of water, so have diluted urine because of problems of the kidney. And I thought, well, this is very cool to have a guy like him being able to figure this out. So let's say we got in contact, and Patrick also said, hey, I'm busy trying to write an hypothesis paper. So I thought, well, why not we team up, because I can bring in my scientific background and knowledge about these things. Besides that, I'm very interested anyway about the whole mechanisms here in relation to CFS and long COVID, and let's see where it brings us. So let's say that's more or less the status that we are now. That let's say I had some details about taste for salt, because I was surprised that you drink so much water, whereas the taste for salt comes. So we looked into scientific literature about what's now out there on these kind of things, and there are even connections possibly to EPO, which is also very well known to be reduced in MSCFS patients, certainly patients with POTS. So we came up with, we could broaden a bit the thought, but also could bring in the more scientific basis. And let's say, of course, I could also use my scientific collaborators from the past, because I'm not working on water homeostasis anymore, to hear their opinion and to, let's say, maybe improve the manuscripts. So that's something we would like to send out to see whether there is a scientific community there. I also asked some of my colleagues, my ex-colleagues, about whether they would be interested to step on this, because I'm not into academia anymore, but into my own company. One of them was a bit interested in it, but he said, well, I would like to know whether these patients really have hyponatremia. So it means a low sodium concentration in blood. So together with Patrick, we connected a UK organization to write out a survey to ask for patients who have possibly measured this, because that is then very handy, let's say useful for this academic group to bring it into their own scientific field. If they focus on hyponatremia, they would like to have the connection in order to do something with it. And then we can, of course, let's say, stimulate scientific research using our knowledge, but also combining it with their knowledge in order to get deeper on what is now really the cause of this excessive water drinking in long COVID and ME/CFS patients.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
I think what I'm starting to realize about, research is that it takes a long time. And each research study is not going to solve everything. One research study is a step on the ladder to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. But in order to get the sort of holy grail, you have to start somewhere. And this survey that you are working on with long COVID support, I will make sure that goes in the show notes when this episode goes out, because I guess that's the first step, isn't it? You know that there are people who also have this symptom, but you need some actual data to show that, I suppose, before you can go on to the next stage. What I think might be useful to just talk about a little bit, we've kind of danced around water and salt and low blood volume and low salt. Can we just talk a little bit about the kind of, I suppose, biomechanics of why does the salt help? The salt makes the body absorb the water, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it? So what happens there?
Well, let's say that's the point is, let's say, when, because water is uncharged, you could say it is bipolar, but it's one charge. It is affected in our body, attracted by any molecule, and our body uses sodium chloride mainly as the molecules to attract water. So this is called osmosis, and osmosis, that means water moving from the one side to the other side. But the movement of water from the one side to the other side is the attraction by other molecules. And sodium chloride, as Patrick also mentioned, is about 135 to 140 millimolar concentration about this. That's the highest of those ones. And that's used by our body mainly to attract water. So also when also the kidney, when our kidney filters our blood volume 180 liters a day, what it filters. So the whole blood volume goes through it about 30 times per day with a healthy person. And that means that's a lot, because we only pee about 1.5 liter, right? Normally the healthy persons. So that means that the kidney more or less reabsorbs nearly 180 liters of water per day. And it does that by taking up salt from the urine in an active way. So it brings it to the inside, you could say. And because salt is then on the inside, it is an attractive force for water to come along. So salt is the way, sodium chloride mainly, is the way to be able to maintain our water in our body.
So it's the salt that traps the water to stay in the body. And if we don't have the salt, then there's no sort of magnetic pull of the water into the body. So it goes straight through, effectively.
Exactly. So this system that we talked about, the RAS system, so the angiotensin and aldosterone, those are the two last hormones. Those are very active in the kidney to stimulate sodium reabsorption. And when that is not occurring, then the inside is not salty. And thus water will not get there because it's not attracted by the salt on the inside.
And that's a point Peter made to me, is that in a healthy person, if their renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is working okay, if that person's just drinking normal water, they can maintain their blood volume, because the RAS system is instructing the kidneys to hold on to salt that's already in the body. So it kind of works regardless. The problem in ME/CFS and long COVID and POTS is that the RAS is not working, it's suppressed. And so you are losing this salt, and just drinking plain water can lead into a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and I suppose the analogy that a sort of healthy person might be able to understand would be the post-exercise situation. So where you push yourself super hard, you're sweating loads, maybe it's really hot, maybe you're not taking in enough water, and you feel the salt on your skin, don't you, afterwards? And that's why athletes take in electrolytes afterwards, I guess, to replace that. So in that situation, the stressor is the exercise rather than the illness. But I suppose that's maybe something that people without long COVID or ME/CFS might be able to relate to a little bit, because you find there that, you can drink tons and tons and tons of water, but yeah, it goes straight through. And actually, you still have a splitting headache because you've not drunk enough water while you were exercising, for example. Because I guess, for someone who hasn't experienced it's very difficult to kind of really understand. I mean, your opening gambit, Patrick, was, it sounds a bit benign, but it's not. And I think that's kind of quite an important point. Just being thirsty isn't just being thirsty, or it certainly can expand into something that isn't just. For anyone listening, I'm making those air quotes around just, because there is no just here.
No, in fact, it's a low blood volume and not being able to, I say, when you think about POTS, people who stand up and have a reduced blood volume, or at least not enough blood gets pumped up, is being able to be pumped up by your heart to your brains. Then, of course, the brain gets a sort of lack of oxygen, or otherwise at least blood. And that by itself, of course, is what the brain cells do need oxygen more or less all the time, because neurons are the most energy consuming cells that we do have. So when they run only also for short periods of time out of blood volume and thus also oxygen, they get stressed by that, and that can cause inflammation. So the inflammation is, for example, also, let's say, identified in ME/CFS patients and in long COVID patients, is to some extent related. Let's say you have a higher chance of getting these things when you have a low blood volume or POTS, because POTS is more or less, let's say, a way in which the low blood volume shows up in some way.
Yeah. So I suppose leading on from that, the question is, okay, well, we start to have this understanding now. We've got the hypothesis, we have a bit of an idea of what's going on. What do we do next? So how do we boost the blood volume? How do we get the RA system to be working? And where do we go from here?
In terms of the first question, anyway, I'll say what I've done that I've found has turned things around for me. So we talked about drinking electrolytes. We've talked about adding salt, but not all electrolytes are created equal. And the most helpful thing I found is drinking oral rehydration solutions. So in the UK, people will be familiar with something like Diorolite. In America, Pedialyte, Normalite, Vitalite, there's different makes of them. If people don't know what those are, they're little sachets of glucose, salt, and potassium. And people will probably have taken them after diarrhea or vomiting in the past. Now, the amazing thing about these sachets is that there's something in the stomach called the sodium glucose co-transporter. And so when you have a mixture of salt and glucose in the right proportions, the stomach is capable of pulling that salty solution very neatly into the bloodstream. So when you drink, let's say, half a liter of Diorolite, all of that salty solution will be pulled from the stomach into the bloodstream. And that therefore has a really effective impact on boosting blood volume, more effective than if you were just putting lots of salt on your food. In fact, much more effective than that, because that's a bit messy. It's harder for the body to process that in the same way. So there was a study some years ago by Meadow, which looked at drinking a liter of oral rehydration solution over a half hour in POTS patients and compared that to a group that got a saline infusion of a liter as well. And what it actually found was that the oral rehydration solution group boosted their blood volume as effectively as the saline IV group. So it had a really powerful impact. And speaking from my own experience, now these days I drink 1.5 liters of ORS every day. In the past, I used to drink more, but I drink 1.5. And what I find is, let's say I'm drinking a liter of oral rehydration solution over a couple of hours. By the time I get towards the end of that liter, I am feeling very different. The blood is getting back into my skin, it's getting into my muscles, it's getting into my brain. My body feels lighter. There are times when I'm in a crash and I'm stapled to the couch. I can't move. I drink a liter of ORS and, it has a sort of quasi-biblical effect, like Patrick was touched and then he got up and walked, like you actually, basically, you can suddenly engage in life. I can sit up, I can walk around, I can do stuff. And only before I just couldn't move. So it has a really powerful effect on feeling better. And for me, it's been the most helpful supplement, the most helpful anything that I have found, not just in reducing the thirst and bringing that weight down, but in improving functionality. So that's been the most helpful thing for me. Now, I've come across people who say that ORS doesn't work for them very well. And sometimes that's because they're still drinking a lot of normal water, which is then counteracting the effect of the electrolytes. So without giving medical advice, I've personally found that if the majority of your fluids come from ORS, it has a better effect.
So it's doing more with less.
Yes, it is, yeah.
So maybe if we hand over to Peter for what comes next. You've got a medtech startup, is that correct?
Correct.
And you're making plans, starting to make stuff happen.
So I said, let's say I've always been interested to understand the mechanism underlying disease in general. Let's say, to my opinion, and I can't share everything because let's say I have a company, so let's say I need to let's say what I would like, what I'm going to try, what I'm had to is to develop a diagnosis which allows GPs to make a diagnosis just very fast. And that can be done in first instance with just taking blood and sending it to a laboratory. But they say I would like to develop a sensor as well, because I can develop a sensor based on the way in which we can make the diagnosis, which when it would be 24/7 kind of sensor like the glucose. I don't know whether you're aware of familiar with those ones, but you have those glucose sensors which you can wear on your arms, which give you 24/7 information on your glucose level. I see that I can do the same thing for parameter that I'm looking at. And I think that there's a way in which I'm going to develop a diagnosis which is based on some parameters, which the diagnosis can be made fast. But the 24/7 sensor, I expect this sensor to be also possible to use by patients, for example, to help them in recognizing when they get to PEM, for example. And that's a bit of a long-term thing because that takes a lot of time and also money. Let's say they have to be, those are medical devices, so they have a lot of regulatory steps besides technical things. But let's say I see the need, and that's I've always been quite busy with. I would also always like to help people, and I said there's so much need in ME/CFS and long COVID patients that I feel that this is a very important way to go. So let's say the startup was only there for two years. It's called Stressing for Health. The website will likely become available this week, and I'm just in fact building the company. In fact, I asked Patrick, because Patrick is a fantastic guy. Let's say he's a knowledgeable guy in this stuff, and and also good in the PR to be part of my team as well. But that's cool. So the collaboration goes even further than just writing a paper about the stuff. But that's the fact that so I'm in a state that I'm looking for investors to come along with me to develop it and help long COVID and ME/CFS patients more or less. And that would be. Let's say I'm 62. I just started up a company when I was 62, so it was completely new field. I stepped out of the academia, but it's the goal that I have is so high that it gives me a lot of energy to work on this stuff.
So this is going to be a device that is a bit like a continuous glucose monitor that's going to be detecting, instead of glucose, some sort of inflammatory marker. And you're not releasing exactly what this is yet. But the idea is that it's going to be able to predict an upcoming post-exertional malaise episode. So this is quite interesting because it's that similar kind of technology, but used in a slightly different way that's more applicable to things like ME/CFS and long COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, in some way. Let's say, from my point of view, there is something which is very fundamental under many of the different features of long COVID or ME/CFS, among others, the low RAS system. And I said that, let's say, when I would like to develop a sensor, it means that an investor needs to be interested, and they're interested when they can earn some money with it. So therefore, I cannot share all the different things. But to my opinion, this is quite basic to many of the features of long COVID and ME/CFS. So I think I can make quite a difference for the patients to improve their quality of life. If I die with that knowledge, that is great.
From a patient perspective, I think it could be game-changing because it would basically be monitoring something in the blood that, if it's going too high, it's indicating that you're moving towards a crash. And so it would actually take the guesswork out of pacing, potentially. It would just beep at you when you're doing too much or when someone's stressing you out or whatever it is. And in that way, you get real-time feedback, slow down, take it easy. And it could help people avoid crashes over a longer period, which is what is, of course, important if you have to have any chance of actually healing.
Yeah, and I suppose, like we were saying earlier, we're constantly told, oh, listen to your body will tell you what to do. And, for the most part, actually, yes, it will if we listen to it. That is part of the problem, that we're not very good at doing that. But actually, as you kind of alluded to earlier, in a lot of people, this signal is not really working correctly. So you may not be getting that signal. So you can listen to your body all you like, But actually, if it's not giving you that signal, then you're going to struggle to respond to it because it's not there or it's not working. So if you, I suppose, had something to alert you, you're able to go, okay, let's get some hydration sachets on the go. Let's sit down. Let's take a chill, whatever it is that works for you in that situation. And, it's that kind of signal from the body. You're sort of, finding a way to make that work before, I mean, we all know when we've hit the crash, but by the time you've got to that point, it's like, well, I can't really do anything about it now. It would have been really nice if I'd had that signal, 10 minutes ago before I hit the pit of doom kind of things.
And needless to say, pacing, of course, pacing by itself, of course, is quite difficult to do anyway, because you continuously have to balance on what is possible is not. What you can do on the one day is not necessarily what you can do on the other day. And I think it will cover that variations between days or maybe even on the day as well.
And sometimes you want to get away with something if you can, because you might have that mentality like I do. And if something's beeping at me and saying, you're not going to get away with this, actually, I'd be far more likely to take that seriously if I knew that a crash was going to be my reward.
Yeah, but I suppose conversely to that, if you were like wondering whether or not to do the thing and your monitor was saying, actually, you're all right, then, it would actually allow you to do the thing without the constant worry about whether you're going to overdo it.
Yeah.
So I suppose it will allow you a little bit more control in some ways. And I think control is something that with something like long COVID and ME/CFS, we feel like we have very little of. So I suppose having something that we do have a little bit is, that's quite empowering, I think. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an absolute delight, and I'm so excited to hear where this goes. So I will drop all of those links that we've mentioned, including the survey and all of the research, the book, the blog. So if anyone wants to follow up with that, then please do. And maybe we can talk when some of this stuff is a bit further down the road and see what's kind of shaken out, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for this nice interview. I enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. It's been a real pleasure, and it'd be great to come back if we can make some progress with these things.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.